Jules, are you ready? All right, we are going to be reading Corrie, tenBoom, Keeper of the Angel's Den by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 12 titled number 66730. Gather your things together, you're moving out now, screamed one of the female guards. Corrie looked at Betsy and breathed a sigh of relief. If they were taking their belongings with them, then probably they really were going to be transferred somewhere and not just lined up outside and shot like the men had been. So the two sisters stuffed their meager belongings into a pillowcase. There was a small bottle of vitamin drops from a Red Cross parcel. It was nearly empty, but they were trying to stretch it as far as possible. Nolly had sent Betsy a blue woolen sweater. Amazingly, the package containing it had reached her in Brook. Corrie stuffed the sweater into the pillowcase. Their belongings barely made a bump in the bottom of the pillowcase as Corrie swung it over her shoulder. The only thing they owned that was too precious to put in the pillowcase. The only other thing they owned was too precious to put in the pillowcase. It was a small Bible Nolly had given Corrie at the reading of their father's will. Betsy had made a small cloth pouch for it in the sewing room, and it always hung around one of their necks. Nolly had given Betsy a Bible at the same time, but Betsy had given it to another needy woman. So now she and Corrie shared Corrie's Bible. Their belongings in hand, the two sisters lined up for one last roll call at Brook concentration camp. After roll call, the women were marched 5 abreast out of the camp. A large truck was parked at the gate. As each line of prisoners marched past the gate, As each line of prisoners marched past the truck, it was stopped for a moment, and every woman in the line was handed a blanket. This made no sense to Corrie. They had just left blankets in the barracks, so why take the time to hand out new ones? Corrie couldn't think of an answer, but then so many things the Germans did made no sense to her. Since the blankets were thick, much too heavy for Betsy to carry in her weakened state, Corrie carried Betsy's blanket as well as her own as they marched away from the camp. The women retraced the route they had marched to Brook from the train. When they reached the railroad tracks, a guard ordered them to halt. Corrie peered up and down the track, but saw no passenger train like the one that had brought them from Scheveningen, only a line of large boxcars. German soldiers were perched on top of them, their machine guns pointed at the women. Once Corrie would have been terrified if someone pointed a gun at her. Now she thought nothing of it. The women to the left of Corrie looked up at the soldiers. What does it matter if they shoot us now? We're all going to die anyway, she said. Corrie reached out her hand to comfort the woman. She wanted to say, that's not true. Don't think like that. But it would be a lie. After all, look at what the Nazis had done to the men the day before. A tall, dark-haired soldier marched the length of the train, unlocking the boxcars and sliding their doors open. Corrie gasped. She knew what was going to happen. All the women, about 1,000 of them, were going to be pushed into the boxcars, which had no windows or seats, and weren't designed to carry animals, much less human beings. Move it, you old cows! We've got to get 80 of you in each car, a guard near Corrie yelled. Corrie felt a gun press into her back, and together the women surged onto the boxcar. Several of them had to help Betsy up, as it was too high for her to climb. Once inside, they moved as far back as they could, as more women were ordered into the boxcar. Finally, when Corrie could hardly breathe, the door was slid shut. The women were alone in total darkness. At first, they all panicked. Women screamed and clawed at the walls, but after about an hour, they calmed down enough to organize themselves. They found that if each woman sat with her legs apart, like a bobsled, there was enough room for them all to sit on the floor of the boxcar. They tucked their blankets around themselves and waited. During the rest of the day, the boxcar was shunted forwards and backwards, never moving more than a few feet in either direction, as the boxcars were connected to form a long train. Inside, women needed to go to the bathroom, but there was no bucket and no way to climb over the wall of bodies to get to one, even if there had been. They had no choice but to go right where they were sitting. Corrie didn't know which was worse, the embarrassment or the stench. By nightfall, some of the women sitting near the sides of the boxcar had managed to gouge some small holes in the timber, and some fresh air trickled in. About the same time, the women heard popping noises against the outside of the boxcar. They all sat still and listened. Sounds like hailstones, whispered one of the women. No, it's not on the roof. It's just hitting the side of the car, said another woman. Machine guns, said yet another woman. They were being fired upon. This could mean only one thing. The Allied forces must be very close. Excitement filled the boxcar. At any moment, the doors could be flung open and they could be free. But neither happened. Half an hour later, they felt the train begin to move. Slowly at first, and then gathering speed. The excitement left the boxcar as quickly as it had come. The women sat in silence. There was no need to say anything. It was obvious they were headed east into Germany. Where else was there left to take them? Why are they bothering to take us to Germany? We are a group of weak, half-starved Dutch women. Why would they waste a train trip on us? Corrie asked out loud. No one in the boxcar could think of an answer. The train sped on. The boxcar smelled so disgusting that Corrie had to force herself to breathe. The women near the holes in the side of the boxcar yelled out to notify the others when it got dark or light. First, one night passed, then another, and then a third. Finally, the train ground to a halt. The women heard the sound of the young boys yelling in German, and then the door to the boxcar slid open. Corrie raised her arm to shield her eyes from the intense light that spilled in. The pressure of 80 women packed into such a tiny space pushed out those near the door. The women fell the 4 feet onto the stones beside the railroad track. More of the women inside the boxcar crawled towards the fresh air. They were all too exhausted to do anything more than fall out of the doorway on top of the others. Soon there were large piles of women outside the door of every boxcar in the train. Slowly the stronger women pulled themselves free of the piles. There was a small lake about 20 feet from the train, and the women began to crawl towards it. Corrie was one of them. She left Betsy in the pile of women and promised to come back for her. Over the rough rocks she crawled, her knees bleeding as she went and her eyes fixed firmly on the water in front of her. Finally, Corrie collapsed beside the lake. She sank her face into the water. How wonderful it felt. She felt it lap over her hair and around her neck. She gulped mouthfuls of it all along the lake edge. Other women were doing the same. After a few minutes, Corrie felt strong enough to sit up. She looked around. Unlike the guards in Holland, who were grown men and women, the guards here were teenage boys. Some of them didn't even look 15 years old. Corrie shook her head. Over 1,000 women were being controlled by 7 teenage boys with guns? In truth, there was no need for more than 7 guards. None of the women had the strength to resist. One of the young guards, carrying a pile of canvas bags, threw one down near Corrie. "Carry water," he barked in German. I'm trying to think how to translate that. Water is Wasser in German. Corrie dipped the bag into the lake and stood up. Her whole body wobbled as she staggered back to the train with the water. Betsy had managed to crawl a little distance from the pile of other women. Corrie found her and poured some water over her. "Thank you, danke," she mouthed through her cracked lips. Corrie went on, pouring some water into other prisoners' mouths. Some of them, though, were unconscious, and the eyes of others were rolled back in their sockets. Corrie knew they were dead. When the water was gone, Corrie handed the canvas bag to another prisoner and lay down beside Betsy. It was a beautiful sunny day. Birds cheeped in nearby trees, and a German farmer drove his horse and hay cart down the road beside the railroad track. It all seemed so normal, except for the dead and dying women lying beside the train. "Get up, get moving," screamed one of the young guards, hitching up his uniform hands, which were too big for him. Corrie stayed where she was. How easy it would be to give up right now, she thought. Betsy and I could die together, lying in the sun, listening to the birds. "Come on, we have to get up," Betsy's voice broke into her thoughts. Corrie turned her head to look at her sister. She could clearly see the bones beneath her skin and the shape of her skull beneath her thin, gaunt face. Betsy's lips were dry and cracked. Corrie scrambled to her feet. If her big sister could go on, so could she. Supporting each other, Corrie and Betsy joined the ragtag line of women that had begun disappearing over a small rise to the right of the train, past the small lake. Slowly, the 2 sisters climbed to the top of the rise. By the time they got there, Betsy was completely out of breath. They stood for a moment looking down from the rise. The sight laid out below made Corrie close her eyes in fear and dread. Stretching as far as she could see was row upon row of gray clapboard buildings, just like the ones they had left in A huge brick wall with barbed wire along its top surrounded the buildings, and towards the front of the compound was a large concrete building with a huge smokestack protruding from its center. Blue-gray smoke belched from it. Even as Corrie stood with her eyes closed, the reality of where they were could not be shut out. God help us, it's Ravensbrück, whispered one of the other women. Corrie reached out to steady herself against her sister. She had heard of Ravensbrück. Everyone in Holland had. It was a death camp for women. A place that thousands of women were forced into by the Nazis, but from which few ever came out alive. Betsy whispered into Corrie's ear, "Remember, there is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still." Corrie nodded. Still clutching their pillowcase, Corrie and Betsy marched down the hill and into the notorious Ravensbrück concentration camp with the hundreds of other women from Vught who were still alive after their journey from Holland. To the left of the main gate was a large open area covered with straw, and the women were herded into it and told to wait. Corrie sighed. There it was again. The Germans were always getting them to hurry up just so they could wait at the other end. As the women reached the straw, they sank down into it. Corrie and Betsy found a spot too. "Oh no!" exclaimed a prisoner near them as she leapt to her feet. "Lice! The place is alive with lice!" And so it was. Corrie looked at the straw that was seething with tiny, biting insects. The women looked at each other as if to say, "What can we do?" They were too weak to stand any longer. They had no choice but to flop down on the louse-infested straw. After an hour or so, all the women were again seated on the straw, and then the hair cutting began. The Nazis did not order it. The women did it themselves. Several women had scissors, which were slowly passed from woman to woman. They began to cut off each other's hair. When the scissors were handed to her, with tears in her eyes, Corrie cut off Betsy's once beautiful auburn hair. Probably something like this. Next, Betsy cut off Corrie's hair. As it fell to the ground, Corrie noticed that in the short time she had been a prisoner of the Nazis, her hair had turned from dark brown to gray. The women sat on the straw for the rest of the day and on through the night. It rained heavily, and their blankets were soaked. Betsy started to cough. At first she coughed up phlegm, later blood. Corrie helped her put on Nolly's woolen sweater, but it did not help much. Throughout the night and all the next day, Corrie had to help Betsy to the ditch the women were using as a toilet. For 2 full days, they were left sitting on the louse-infested straw with only a slice of black bread and a cup of so-called coffee twice a day to keep them alive. Finally, as night was about to fall on the 3rd day, a guard yelled for the women to line up and follow him. They filed past a desk where each woman was given a number. Corrie was prisoner number 66730, and Betsy was number 66729. Next, the women were counted off into groups of 50 and told to wait. Since Corrie was at the front of her group, she could see what was happening. The first group of 50 women were told to leave all their belongings, including the blankets, in a pile by the door of a long, low building. No one was recording who had left what behind. Corrie's heart chilled. That could mean only one thing. They were not going to get the things back. After the women had handed over their belongings, they were told to strip naked and step into the building. For 15 horrible minutes, Corrie thought they had been ushered into a gas chamber. Then, to her relief, she caught sight of the women coming out of the door at the far end of the building. They were all wearing thin cotton dresses with a large X sewn on the front and on the back. Panic gripped Corrie as she watched. What would she and Betsy do without their Bible? And Betsy needed the warm woolen sweater Nolly had sent her too. God, she prayed as she stood waiting for their turn to be processed, please help me to find a way to get these things through. Just then, Betsy doubled over. My stomach, she groaned. I have to go to the bathroom fast. Corrie looked around. They were too far away from the ditch they had used for the past few days. Bravely, she stepped out of line and spoke to a guard. My sister has to go to the bathroom now. She is sick. She cannot wait. The guard looked at the two of them and growled. Over there, use the shower drain. He pointed his rifle towards the entrance the naked women had gone in. Corrie helped Betsy to the showers, which were in a huge, dark, damp room with a row of moldy chairs stacked at the far end. In a flash, Corrie had an inspiration. "Quick, Betsy, take off your sweater," she said. Without questioning, Betsy took it off and handed it to her sister. "Watch for the guards," Corrie whispered as she pulled the Bible in its pouch over her head. She ran the length of the shower building and tucked the Bible, bottle of vitamins, and the blue woolen sweater between the chairs. In less than a minute, she was back beside Betsy. "Let's get back into line quickly," she said, helping Betsy up. Once in line again, they had another half hour to wait until it was their turn to strip and shower. The whole dehumanizing process was made bearable by the fact that they had their things waiting for them near the exit to the showers. A pile of well-worn dresses was dumped on the floor, and the women scrambled to find one that fit for them. Corrie found the perfect dress for Betsy. It had long sleeves, which would hide the sweater underneath. Betsy put it on, while Corrie found a dress for herself. In the confusion of the other women trying to find a dress that fit, Corrie slipped away and recovered the things she had hidden between the chairs. She pulled the pouch with the Bible in it over her head. She slipped the bottle of vitamin drops inside the pouch as well, and she tied the sweater around her waist under her dress. Then she rejoined the group. "Line up by the door," yelled a guard who had just walked in. Corrie's heart sank as she joined the line. 3 more guards had appeared, and by hand they were searching each woman from head to toe. They would surely feel the sweater in the pouch in an instant. "God," she prayed again in desperation, "we can go through anything if we have this Bible with us. Please send your angels to hide it from the guards." Corrie took a deep breath. The woman in front of her was being searched. It would be her turn next. But her turn never came. Instead, the guard reached right past her and began to search Betsy. Corrie just kept walking. Later, when she talked to the other women processed that day, Corrie discovered she was the only one who had not been searched. Tears ran down her cheeks as she thanked God for protecting the Bible, and she wondered about what lay ahead for the tenBoom sisters.